6 p.m. on a Friday. We joke like,
if you go, like, it's like crazy. That's not.
Like,
Yeah,
what kind of, like, I'll be asking
which is incomplete.
That's right, he said he went there.
Yeah, it's actually.
Oh, the whole weekend. I was in
the hell.
Are mine?
Yep.
How's it going?
At least that's
Good.
We're
like,
Oh yeah, do you have internet?
yeah. Honestly, if I had been in the same situation, where I would have been like,
Yeah, we're like watching all these rules, so I'm
not a small
middle of trying to do all and stuff.
yeah, after a while, it's like,
so want to get
Oh, I
my
see.
shot done building it, so.
Well, yeah, how, like, are you?
I don't know, I did see that.
Fun.
I'm saying
Well,
that's
the Ben had messaged
That's
me
good.
saying
Have you
that
guys hired like
either
designers
not
or still?
there still, or I don't know.
It was just me, and there's definitely no.
I ask people and ask.
So you're,
We might look into co-op.
yeah, nonetheless, I'm gonna start.
Like,
Like getting co-op like early, but I'll probably watch the
Everybody.
for hours.
Check.
Welcome.
Hey, folks. Thanks for coming out tonight. Yeah, it's awesome to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well, which is great. And every couple of days I go on the meetup and I see there's a few more people that are members in the group. So we're like slowly growing as we go with this, which is pretty exciting. Yeah, welcome again. And yeah, we have some social media handles there. We finally have someone who's going to help us properly with our social media, Susanna, who's over here. So we have some, yes, very exciting. We have some handles that you can follow us at if you're into that sort of thing. We have some Wi-Fi that you can grab there, and just with the welcome to Shopify password. Bathrooms are just around the corner. And Pat and Angela have some guest fobs for you if you need to get in and out. That's Pat there in the back. Pat and Angela, in fact, in the back. But they're such superstars. I'm sure that you all know who they are by now.
I'm on the table over there.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Just put them on the table. Yeah. And then you don't have to ask someone. Asking somebody for something. Ooh, so nervous. I'll just wait till I get home. Yeah. Okay, here we are into the slide about hiring. Sam is going to come up here, Samantha is going to come up here and just give us a little rundown about Wind River and a new position that is opening up. So let's hear it for Samantha Shepherd, everyone.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. This is going to be really quick, but I am a technical writer at Wind River. It's a software company in Canada North, and we have 3 technical writer positions open right now, 1 senior and 2 junior. So we're hoping people will apply for those. If you're interested, you can check out our careers page at windriver.com. We have the postings up on LinkedIn, or you can just come ask me questions afterwards if you're interested. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I feel like there's some, let's hear it for her. It's awesome. I feel like we have some Write the Docs alumni that used to work at Wind River, actually. And I'm just drawing a blank, of course. Who's the awesome guy that gave the last remote presentation here? Remember, he's our hero, Lincoln. And he wrote every page is page 1.
Oh, Mark Baker.
Mark Baker, yeah. Didn't he used to work at Wind River? I remember there's like a part in the there's a part in the recording of the presentation where it's like, oh, I remember this from when we used to work at Wind River. And Tina used to work at Wind River, I think, as well. So that's all I know about it. But it sounds like a cool company. I'm gonna check it out. So I'm really happy tonight to be doing this focus on developer experience, kind of giving a little bit of an introduction into what developer experience is, for those of you that might not be aware, and then a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the technology side with Ameer. When I first started off at Shopify, I was experienced writing about APIs and documenting, software for an external external audience, but I had no idea there was this whole sort of discipline built up around the experience of documentation and the experience of your platform and your product, and how is that working for your developers, and nurturing like a whole sort of third-party ecosystem of partners, and really being nurturing and encouraging people to build on your platform. And so it was really awesome when I first started at Shopify. It was just like drinking from the fire hose, and I was really lucky because I got a chance to work with Jordan Liddle really early on, and I was struck by his passion for developer experience, his enthusiasm, and for sure your generosity in helping me get over the whole learning curve of working at Shopify. So I'm really stoked to have him here tonight to talk to us a bit about what he does. So before taking on his roles, and before I transition into Jordan, I should also say that we're also really lucky that we'll have Ameer, who will be following up Jordan with a bit of a look at APImatic, which is the company that he works for. Ameer is the VP of Strategy and Business Development at APImatic Limited, and I met him at DevRelCon in London. And of course, I totally nerded out on his presentation because it was all about API specs and using an API spec to generate your developer experience journey for your customers. So I was really on board with that, and I was super happy to connect with him after and get him on board for Write the Docs talk. Cool. So yeah, before Jordan, his current role in go-to-market, he was in the developer experience team, and prior to that, he was in tier 3 support. He was in a tier 3 support specialist role, which I'm sure was super useful in gaining a lot of insight into the customer perspective of documentation of our product. And I'm sure that prepared you really well for what you're doing now. And fun fact, when Jordan's not obsessing over designing killer developer experiences, you can find him exploring foreign cities and landscapes and fly fishing. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about that too. So without further ado, we'll bring up Mr. Jordan Liddle. Let's hear it for him. I'll just give you your laptop. And you should be able to present. Okay. I think we just have to switch up this window. There. You might, like that. There you go. Think of it like that. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Good. I think we just need to minimize the thing. You don't. Yeah. Oh, you'll be fine. That's good. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Wow. Thanks so much for that really awesome introduction. So before anything, I guess this is a meetup. I really want to keep it super casual. I'm going to be kind of diving into a little bit about APIs, developer experience, taking APIs to market, and of course how documentation kind of fits in that. So if you have any kind of questions or confusion, feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, whatever. We don't have to formalize this. Okay, so yeah, my name's Jordan. I lead the API go-to-market team here at Shopify. A little bit about my team. So we basically try to represent the voice of our third-party developers. And Shopify has this kind of app ecosystem for those that are unaware. We have a lot of third-party devs that build out these really great custom solutions or public apps that can be used to kind of extend our software product. So basically, we're trying to represent the voice of our developers. We get their kind of feedback around how our APIs behave, how they work, and we kind of bring that back to the product teams at Shopify and help kind of influence the API product roadmap. So we get the luxury of working with great teams like Andrew Johnston's team. We get to work with product marketing, different product domains of Shopify, and ultimately collaborate to kind of help build out the resources and tooling that allow our developers to build on the platform confidently and successfully. So in the spirit of this docs focus meetup today, I thought maybe we can take this opportunity to do a quick talk on why I think early documentation
is really vital to successful API launches. But I guess it kind of can go into any type of launch, to be honest, like any type of product launch. So yeah, this is going to go a little bit all over the place. Hopefully it'll make sense in the end, but if we got to start somewhere, I think developer experience is definitely a good start. Many of you probably know that like the foundation of like a really great developer experience or a great API is a really great developer experience. And a lot of people kind of have their own interpretation, their own definition of what developer experience is. For me, I know it's a little bit woo-woo, but this is one of my favorite interpretations of it. So DX is about how developers feel when they're using the API, kind of like it's emotive. So if we use, say, empathy as kind of a guiding principle here, let's try to imagine what these developers might be thinking or feeling while using an API. Like, is it easy to understand? Is it fun to use? Is it painless to debug? Is it simple to get help? So the idea is like, how do we actually achieve this like really world-class developer experience that makes you feel so good while you're using an API? How do we like feel like, oh, actually I think poo here. So I don't know if anyone's actually seen Stripe's API documentation. This is like one of the best in the industry. They actually just changed up. They have like dark mode. It's really fantastic docs, because to me, great documentation is really at the heart of great developer experience. Because if you don't have good docs, the API will likely be difficult to learn. And if it's hard to learn, people probably won't use it, especially third-party developers. And if it's an internal API, your software devs will probably take a lot of time to figure out how to develop on it. They'll end up with a lot more bugs, and it can be costly for the time. So it's worth noting that like you can have the best documentation ever written with like sample code, deep dive guides, conceptual content, clear descriptions, what have you. But if your API sucks, I guess like the point I want to make is that good APIs and good documentation go hand in hand, and one doesn't necessarily have to come before the other. So I'm a big advocate of this, of like thinking of APIs as products. It's an important point of view when you're designing, implementing, and taking APIs to market, because your API, it is a product, and why shouldn't it be? I mean, like it's quite easy, you know, as a software developer to kind of like expose your internal implementation. Be like, this is how we do things. This is what works for us, and here you go, world. Let's just share it via API. Kind of like if you were to build your own car whatever way you want, and just say, you know, people will love it too. But the reality is they might not. You might end up with something like this. So design APIs that make sense for your users, not you. So yeah, no, your API is a product. Your API can have consumers, right? Like with their own needs. Shopify has many. Like Shopify has different, what we call like developer personas, like folks that might be using our API for different use cases like shipping, fulfillment, inventory management, theme design, what have you. So they have features. They have roadmaps, life cycles. They can go from beta to general release to deprecated and eventually retired. APIs can also be monetized. So with that in mind, APIs fully deserve proper design thinking, prototyping, developer research, and of course testing. So when you're developing an API, just like if you're developing, say, a new phone or a new car, you need to know your audience, just like a product. You need to understand and solve their most pressing problems and pay attention to the feedback around how you can improve the product. So of course, like, okay, the question is like, where's documentation fit in all this? How can documentation really help deliver a great API product? So my thing is like everywhere, of course, but earlier documentation, I find the better the API product. So my team, we've launched a lot of APIs. I've seen the outcome of releasing APIs when doc writing was like incorporated days before launch. I'm sure, Andrew, you've been there, like right before, like get the docs out there, and then it's catastrophic. But I've also seen it where we implement docs writing in the early stages of API design, for example. And I can tell you, when we take that approach, when we actually bring that API doc writing in the early stages of design, the developer experience always ends up better. So I'm going to actually get into an example. This is probably where we should have documented the API early. So early last year, Shopify launched this new feature and it was called Locations. This was like our first really important step to being like a fully multi-location platform. The idea was that a merchant can go to their locations, they can add new locations if it's like a warehouse, a storefront, a retail, what have you, and then they can take their product catalog, allocate their inventory across multiple locations. It was pretty cool. The challenge from like a platform perspective was that our API, with the tens of thousands of users that were managing inventory, only supported single location workflows. So you had your product resource, pretty simple. It had a field called inventory quantity, and you could set that field via API. It was as simple as that. But what happens when you have apps updating inventory this way on shops that have multiple locations? You can only imagine that it's going to open up tons of shitty opportunities where you can have overselling, underselling, overstock, understock. It's basically like apps saying, here's some inventory, and we go, we'll just stuff it in LA, or we'll stuff it in New York. And then the merchant's like, that was supposed to go in Boston. So in order to ensure that all these apps were updating inventory and that were like compatible with multi-location, we made a really big, bold move as a platform. We said, okay, we're going to just deprecate the existing behavior. We're just going to stop it. We're going to tell everybody, stop doing this thing and start doing this new thing. And this is where it got us. Okay, so we introduced a new resource, and we called it inventory item. That basically contained all the new inventory logic. And that was like us being like, here's what we do. Here, take it, world. An inventory item had a one-to-one relationship with this product. But in order to update inventory on the item, basically you need to query the product and be like, grab me that inventory item ID. Then after fetching the inventory item, and don't worry, you don't have to follow me here, but you want to store that relationship locally, mapping to the item, to the product variant, and then via a different endpoint altogether, you have to update the inventory level, another brand new thing, of that inventory item at a specified location. Oh, and one thing I didn't mention is that they'd actually have to get their users to re-authenticate these new permissions for these new resources. So that's like 3. And I don't know if anyone's actually developed like against APIs, but like that's 3 new calls for what used to be 1. Pretty confusing calls at that, and with some pretty bad naming convention. So as expected, like our partners were like pretty pissed off. Like they were confused. It was just an overall terrible experience. And the sad part about this was it only became really apparent to us how badly the API was designed and how badly it behaved when we started documenting it. And that was way too late to the game. Like at that point, we were like, we have to launch this thing. We're ready to launch this feature to merchants. We can't change it. So now hindsight's always going to be 20/20. When I think, if we would have went through the steps of saying, let's get into the design stage, let's talk and figure out a solution that's going to satisfy the needs of our API consumers, I think that we would have been able to launch some APIs that was a lot better. So early docs also mean that you can get great feedback. And the thing about APIs, it's like they're like you can't really do UX research for APIs in the same way that you would do like a phone or an app. You can't touch it, right? So APIs you have to kind of take home, you have to figure out how to work with it. So since there's no visible interface, you really need to document that journey and help the user fully appreciate its potential. So the great thing about early documentation is that you can document that experience, figure out what works, send it to your beta candidates, or early access participants, or just a group of your users, and get that feedback before a line of code is ever written. And that's what's really great, because it opens up the steady stream that allows you to iterate and figure out how to build the best solution that satisfies your market when you can afford to. I think that's worth mentioning. Okay, so how early is early? There's a lot of debate around this. Some say earlier the better. I'm one of them. I always push my team to be like, as soon as you hear about them developing a new API, you get in that discussion. And it's one of those things where if you collaborate with these teams when they're in the early stages of API design, you're just going to find out that you end up surfacing so many major concerns that you could have figured out down the road. So it has its drawbacks. It's not cheap to write docs, especially in the early design stages where, things change and they change fast. But in the same vein, it can expose usability problems early on, making it more worthwhile in the long term. So it kind of really depends on what your organization's goals are, your budget, everything else. But for me, I definitely say the earlier the better. Documentation methods. When you're delivering early documentation, you can do it in a lot of different ways. You'll have your API reference docs, reading like the encyclopedia with your descriptions, endpoints, properties. You can also provide tutorials, deep dive guides, the whole works. But when documenting early, I personally like to break it into two kind of broad fundamental practices. The teach, don't tell method and the tell, don't teach method. So the tell, don't teach method basically focuses on communicating the facts about the API. It's basically to help users understand its behavior, documenting error codes, property descriptions. It's largely fact-based. It's like this is the API as is. This type of documentation is all about the reference for your API. And I imagine Ameer will actually get to touch on all the types of tooling you can use to produce this type of documentation. But overall, this factual reporting of your API requires much less effort and decision making from your team. And to me, it's the best starting point when you're working on early docs. So teach, don't tell focuses on designing the learning experience. Like this is, instead of laying down the facts, it's about this approach is more of like the story. Goals to help, of course, your API consumers achieve their usability goals while learning how to use your API in like that more focused, targeted manner. So I personally like to get a healthy mix of both. The reality is different users have different needs. Like new users to your API might potentially want to have that story. Like, how does this work? Like, what does it all mean? Like, share the story with me versus the folks that may have been more familiar with your platform, or they're just like, give me the code. Just tell me how to do this thing, and I'm going to get it done. So, in summary, basically, I'm saying always treat your APIs as products. Try to write your docs early, getting up and close in that API design. Implement both teach, don't tell, and tell, don't teach methods when you're writing. And of course, like get user feedback well before launch. And that's all. Thanks, guys. Or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can do that. We've also got some time for some questions.
Oh yeah.
If anyone has any questions for Jordan, we can take some of those now before we get up here now.
Easy. For your early docs, are you putting those in front of like a beta customer? Is that how you're getting feedback?
Yep. So we'll have we have like different types of app developers. Some are actually in like our app store like marketplace. Other ones are actually focused more on like private custom solutions for specific merchants. Typically, we'll use like existing API like monitoring to determine who might be a good beta candidate to reach out to and kind of like get exploration about this. If it's like a brand new API that we haven't touched before, a lot of times we'll just figure out what sort of apps are in that category and just personally reach out and say, listen, we gotta get your feedback. And a lot of time we'll use kind of like this sneak peek doc, because when you're doing these like interviews or these research studies, you're sitting down and trying to kind of like walk through the API. It's like hard to do that in a half an hour. It's kind of like you need to kind of give a little bit of homework to be like, and this is where you mix that teach and tell based methods. So we'll give them a little bit of a sneak peek document to be like, here's kind of an idea, here's kind of the API schema, and then let's follow up with some questions on how, where you may have been confused or what made sense, what are some concerns if you were to build on something today. Cool.
So when you say treat docs like products, and you gave the example of the 3 API calls to do a single task.
Yep.
what would be the outcome of that? Or what would be the role of the person documenting the API? Would they bring it up as a usability issue, or is it just that it needs to be documented really clearly in order for someone to be able to use it?
Yeah, like that's a really fantastic question. So when you're, I guess, like when you're documenting the APIs, I think like to kind of get a good understanding of how it behaves is something when you kind of are in the best position to say like, this is not good, right? Like, you know your users when you're documenting. So in a lot of cases, you can maybe, if something kind of sits up as like, this doesn't feel right. And I've shown this to some folks. I've gotten the feedback, like 3 requests, which for what used to be 1, like that's just, you can't do that. And then, you know, it might be an opportunity to take it back to the drawing board. So I guess it depends on your organization. Of course, like, you know, I've definitely gone to dev teams and been like, this API is not good, and here's why, and they've been like, too bad, and we're done, we're moving on. But usually I find like, that's why kind of the earlier is the better, because they're in that process of working on it. It's not like finished work. So you can kind of say what's kind of like the path you're exploring, and can we try to document that path and take this to some groups to get some feedback, make sure we're actually doing the right thing here.
Would internal APIs inform, like, you would probably have many of these things existing before you even approach, you know, deciding what ones you're going to expose to external?
Yeah, and that's something that we'll face today, is like that Shopify has a lot of internal APIs that it's like, okay, let's flip the switch and expose them externally. And that's great because it's like, okay, at least an API is out there.
It's fast, but it may not be.
It may not be worth it.
How
Yeah.
you've been trying to portray things.
That's exactly it. Yeah. So it's kind of a challenge where you have to kind of find this way to get into when they're developing maybe an internal API that has long-term plans of saying this is going to go to market. We want to expose this publicly. Then it's like, that might be a good opportunity to be like, is this actually something that the public is going to appreciate whenever you decide to open it?
Do you get that chance to like intervene early?
Yeah. So for us, like we typically will get kind of like an insight into the type of projects that are taking place and what sort of features. For Shopify, it's lucky because for the actual admin product, a lot of the times when they're building out admin features, they're building out the APIs and GraphQL when they're doing that. So we get to kind of see that exposure and say, okay, well, is there plans to expose this down the road? Even if you can't imagine it right now, can we think ahead and try to design it in a way that it might be useful for third parties?
How do you guys manage consistency of the nouns and the verbs? Is there some sort of style guide, or?
I think yeah, Andrew can definitely speak to that.
Who's responsible for naming things and the properties, and how do you get consistency across the APIs, or is that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, like we just being a team of writers, that we want to try to ensure that we promote trust in the platform by writing in a consistent manner. So we have a writing style guide that refers to like how we're going to talk about resources and properties, and when we're going to use periods and not periods, and all that little minutiae stuff.
Actually, what I'm talking about though,
But then there's a step before that,
Right?
like the names of
and that's
the methods and the names of the properties and so forth.
Well, it's interesting because what ended up happening is I went on this whole journey of writing this sort of style guide for how we're going to write our APIs, but then I ended up finding myself researching a lot of like API design guides.
Right.
And it was like, I got to this part where I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, at what point do you stop designing an API and start documenting it? There's like this sort of overlap. And sometimes when I would be working with development teams to bring an API, like to document an API essentially, we find out that it was like kind of named differently than some of the other ones. Like, oh, you put an S at the end of this endpoint, whereas some of the other ones don't have it. Like, and they were like, oh, okay, yeah. So we'll switch that to make it in line of the other names of the endpoints. So like documentation kind of becomes their sort of like last chance before it goes out the door into the world.
So the docs team is sort of like the quality control on the naming.
There's also like about a few years ago when our API kind of like landscape was really reaching a point where, okay, we started to see inconsistencies. They created a new team, and it was the API patterns team. So they have the API design style guide that they push aggressively across the ecosystem.
Patterns team.
API patterns. It's a small team, but they have tons of experience in API development, and they're able to kind of set the way we design APIs at Shopify. this is how you do pagination. This is how, like namespace works. This is how, to have that consistency across the platform. Because when you have all these APIs that are kind of Frankenstein in their own right, it doesn't create a great experience. So yeah, it's more like a collaboration between.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
It's
been wonderful.
They're great. Yeah, fantastic team.
Because they provide that layer between us and the teams that are actually documenting or that are actually helping our APIs.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks so much for listening, everyone.
I could ask you like 5 more questions, but we can't do this all night. All right, let's hear it for Jordan. Thanks so much, Jordan. When you were talking about locations, I couldn't help but think of that like diagram that we made to try to like explain.
Oh God.
And there's like a lot of boxes connected to a lot of other boxes and like a lot of arrows that like overlapping. And we had to use color. We had to resort to color coding. That's probably a sign.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this is the color coding system of the legend.
Yeah. We can't get it.
Yeah, I was like, this seems a little much for me right now. But yeah. What else was I gonna say? I don't know. I can't remember. Yeah. So it looks like we've got Ameer here. How you doing, Ameer?
Hi, Andrew. Not too bad. Hi, everyone.
All right. Awesome. I'm glad that you're here and that we can hear you properly. I had a run through schedule to do IT stuff, but it didn't work out. So we've kind of just been flying by the seat of our pants, IT wise tonight. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I met Ameer at DevRel Con in London last year, and he did a fantastic talk. And so I was so happy that I was able to connect with him and interest him to talk to us tonight. So Ameer is VP Strategy and Business Development at API Matic, and API Matic is this really cool DevX company that focuses on specs and tooling around APIs and auto-generated SDKs, and it's something that I've been super excited about for years, and something that I think we're eventually going to be getting at Shopify. And it can be a tremendous effort to make that kind of thing work. And keep it all in sync and keep it up to date with a lot of manual effort. So that's why it's so exciting to have companies like API Matic in the space working and providing really great tooling. So Ameer is a business strategist, and he's also got experience and expertise in strategic management and business planning amongst other of his skills. And in his own words, Ameer is a non-developer who likes to help developers. And he is a graduate from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, which, side note, I actually went to New Zealand, I think 2008 for a couple of weeks. My parents moved there for a year, so right outside of Auckland. So it was pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing place.
It is.
Worth checking out if you get the chance. Okay, well, do you want to try sharing your presentation with us? And we'll make sure we get that up on the screen. Maybe I'll stop presenting, that may help.
Yep, probably. Yeah. Can you guys see my screen?
I think we can. There we go. Yeah, we're all good.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks Andrew for inviting me. Hi everybody. Hi from San Francisco. And we're enjoying the sun here before it gets too foggy. So yeah, I'll be talking about developer experience and of course how automating developer experience through language-specific documentation can really help your API adoption soar. So before I start, let me start by asking a question. How many developers do you guys think are there in the world? Any guesses?
10,000.
10,000.
Yeah.
300. That's a nice number, right? So yeah, as per Stack Overflow, there are like around 50 million developers around the globe, out of which 21 million are professional developers. Well, it's a survey from last year, but interestingly, the numbers haven't changed this year as well. The new report came just a couple of weeks back. So we still have 21 million professional developers across the globe. And here you can see a bit of distribution. So basically, when we were looking at this data, that got us thinking that, hey, although the term developer experience is quite new, that we've been hearing it for the last few years now, but developers are not new. They've been around for decades. So what was developer experience a few decades ago? And that actually started to, get us to the very basics, or try to understand the fundamentals of developer experience. And to get into that, let me share you a snippet of code. So that's machine code. Of course, I wouldn't expect anybody to guess what the code says. So I'll get right on with that. So it's basically a simple swap function. And you can see that in high-level language, it's a simple variable swap. So back in the day, developer used to code in machine code, but now, of course, developers code in high-level language, and then it's compiled and assembled into machine code, because, of course, our machines still speak binary. But the question is, why don't developers code in binary right now? That's because, of course, it's counterproductive and it's not creative, right? Doesn't make sense. So right now, developers do code in the high-level language, but everything else is done in the background. And that basically led us to think, sort of got us to a point where we could think about the developer experience with that. Developer experience is all about focusing on what's creative and abstracting out what's redundant or non-creative. So fast forwarding to API world, we all hear about checklists. We love checklists. So this is one that we really, adore at API-Matic from Kinlane, the API evangelist. So there are different components that we should be focusing when we talk about developer experience. But today I'd just be talking about the two components, the code samples and SDKs, because getting the other components right is pretty straightforward. But when it comes to SDKs and code samples, there are other sort of tricky problems that start to pop up. Because now you're sort of diving into language-specific documentation, and now you have to make decisions because of your limited resources, that where would you want to focus and which communities would you want to drop. So this, again, is a distribution of those 50 million developers from the same survey based on their language communities. Well, mind you, with the new survey, this has slightly changed, but for argument's sake, let's take this one. So in these sort of situations, now you have to make decision. For example, if you don't provide your documentation in, say, Python, then you just take out these yellow guys from the picture. And of course, you might be ending up losing them to your competition. So moving forward, take a quick look at the basics of an API call. Now, before we do, just keep in mind the analogy that we just discussed, that the basics of developer experience is focusing on creative and abstracting out what's redundant. So a structure of basic API call is developers provided with some inputs, configuration, arguments, and authentication credentials. And then the developer goes through specific steps to get to an output or a response, which include, of course, checking and validation, encoding, serialization, then building a call, making that HTTP call, deserialize the response, decode it, and of course, handling errors. So now developers are great. So they can do all these steps, but are these all steps creative, or are they redundant? So all of these steps that you see on the right can be boxed up into an SDK and provided to the developer. So again, talking about SDKs, if a basic SDK is done, if you're able to make an HTTP call, serialize the response, and deserialize it. But why stop there when you can do more? So at API-matic, we believe that SDKs are not just mere API wrappers. So and they should be sort of taking the other redundant tasks out of the hands of developers, like caching and retries, validation, authentication specifically. And the good thing is that all of this can be done through a machine readable description of your API via automation. The next thing that I want to talk about is code samples. Why? Because again, they're your quickest path to the first hello world. This at API-matic, we've been working on SDKs for the last 4.5 years now. And initially, we relied on our customers to bring their own code samples. And so this is, and there are many tools out there that can generate code samples / snippets, if you will. And this is one of those tools in the market, just an example. So what we found out was there were two problems with those generic code samples. A, they were static, so you had to do with whatever's available and use it. So you can't really modify that code sample. And B, they were incomplete, which means they were more of a snippet than a sample that you have to do some coding around it to make it a compilable code. So we recently came up with a solution to this problem through something we call dynamic code samples. And we provide them via sort of an API console that we have. So of course, you guys would have seen many API consoles. This again, I'll show you some examples. So this again is a console where you have a response on the right and you've got parameters on the left. So you see here an example, so there's this create share payload. If I type in email address over here, it gets populated in the code on the right. Right. So now the developer is sort of interacting with the code sample, sort of creating a unique code sample specific to their own use case. But so let's go on. So here there's an option of adding a new variable. If I click on that, so sort of fields pop up on the left, and on the right you can see that the relevant code is also populated with specific fields that I've put in the input over here. So what if there are multiple options that a developer can choose? For example, share type, personal can have multiple options. Of course, your developers are great, so they can go back to the documentation and figure out what those multiple options are and sort of use them in the code sample. But why don't we provide that right here in your API console? So here you see our code generator picks it up from your API description and populates the option. So service provider, enterprise, and the moment I click enterprise, a variable company type.enterprise is created on the right. So this sort of basically is sort of shows that how dynamic we want to make a code samples to be. And again, initially the second problem when I mentioned was being incomplete. So again, this is still a code snippet. But what if your developer is writing their first hello world and writing code from scratch? So if I click show complete file, the entire code is generated where developer can just copy and paste it and just reach the first hello world. So at APImatic, what we've been trying here is sort of trying to blend what the creative bit and auto-generating the redundant bit to basically give a holistic developer experience where developers can sort of get rid of the most redundant bits and get to what they do best. So to conclude, what developers should be doing. So on the provider side, they should be designing and developing wonderful APIs that reflect the business value of the company. And on the consumer side, of course, your developers should be using those APIs and developing wonderful apps. But what they end up doing is all those redundant tasks, including creating, testing, updating docs and portals, doing code samples by hand, SDKs by hand. On the consumer side, handling HTTP logic, authentication, caching, and retries. So here we believe that these redundant tasks can all be taken out of the lives of developers via automation, and that is where we can provide good developer experience to our consumers. So in the end, I'd like to end with a quote that we really like at APImatic by Nelson Mandela. So he says, if you talk to a man in the language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his native language, that goes to his heart. So developers are no different. If you're talking to them in their favorite language, you'll reach their heart, and of course, increase your API adoption in the end. So, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ameer. Really appreciated hearing some of those concepts again. I was wondering, do we have some time for more questions if anyone wants to jump in? I was wondering, what are some of, if you don't mind going into this, what are some of the stumbling blocks or challenges that you find companies face when they're trying to adopt a tool like APImatic? If they already have a pre-existing API, for example, and they want to kind of gain some of these efficiencies and some of these benefits that you're talking about, how do you go from there and kind of breach the gap and get over to the other side?
Of course, yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. And we've had some enterprise customers who've already been advanced in their API programs, and when they decided, that it was too much to handle manually, and when they migrated towards us. It's of course not an easy path, but we do transition through there's when you're auto-generating code, there's always there's sort of a trade-off between how much you can customize and then how much you can automate. But we do work closely with our clients sort of to smoothen that out and sort of customize as much as we can the experience, so that the experience for the developers doesn't change much, and we add that automation to them as well.
And is everything powered by the open API spec? Like does the customer have to get their API into spec format first before it will talk to your tooling, or?
Exactly, yeah, but we're not limited to open API spec. So we've got a tool called Transformer. So it doesn't matter, we support all the popular formats in the world. So it doesn't matter which format your spec is being kept. So APImatic can take that spec and generate documentation, be it an API blueprint or an open API spec. But yes, the quality of code generation does depend upon how neatly the open API spec is maintained or your spec is maintained. But we do work closely with our clients, of course, sort of to maximize the sort of benefits, and so we do work closely in sort of getting those specs right, so that the maximum benefit of automation can be generated.
Right. And do you guys also work on the side on that side of like maintaining the specs, keeping them up to date, so that or does the client kind of worry about that piece?
No, that's actually the only bit the client has to worry about, maintaining the spec, because of course clients do understand the business logic on their own. That's reflected in the API. So that's something that they do. We do support through audits, and sort of we do provide support in sort of helping the clients out, but that's the only bit that they have to worry about. The rest of the things, so getting started guides, API documentation, code samples, SDKs, everything else is auto-generated.
Well, you have a question, Jordan?
What's API Medic's stance on GraphQL APIs? Seems like you're largely dependent on REST APIs.
Yeah, you're actually right. We haven't gotten there yet. So we currently focus on REST APIs. I knew that question was coming, but but yeah, not in near future, but soon we'll be getting there. Yes.
That's awesome to hear. Yeah, I mean, I think REST is going to be around for a long time. That's the
Yeah.
idea. It's a power of a whole different type of use case, but it's cool to hear that you guys are investing in GraphQL.
True.
Yeah, there seems like there's a lot of tools for REST, and we don't have as many options for GraphQL. Like,
what are some of the popular programming language that you're finding your clients' consumers are using?
Oh, well, there are all sorts. Of course, Python, Ruby, these are popular. And we support like good 10 programming languages. And if you talk about, so I'm not that, maybe no, hold on, I'll just let me ask my product manager, he's around, and I'll actually let you know.
that's convenient.
Yeah, so got the number. .NET, Java, Python, and Ruby. So these are the popular 4 languages that we've got.
Very cool.
It's convenient to have a friend around when you need one.
Yeah.
It's like
I
that,
was lucky. He was just sitting across the table, so I just bugged him.
Yeah. It's like having the lifeline in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire.
Phone a friend, huh?
Yeah, I was curious, the screenshots that you were showing earlier, or of the interface, the API console. Is that something that's like built into the documentation interface, or is that like a separate tool, or?
No, it is built. Yeah. This is built into the documentation interface. So that's pretty much the heart of the documentation that we provide.
Okay, and that was like the customer facing view of like the person.
Exactly.
The person.
So your end user, your developers would be seeing this console.
And they go through and they make the selections, and they.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one thing I have a hard time getting my head around, is kind of like, how do you in kind of a systematic fashion, how do you showcase all of the different kind of use cases and calls that your API can make? Like how
we're constantly evolving around that, because not all APIs are alike, and we do bump into these use cases, and that's the interface that you just saw. A new one is just around the corner. We'll be launching it soon. So we're constantly updating that based on the new use cases we keep bumping into. For example, we just saw a drop-down menu of 3 options. What if there are like 20 options, or 100 options? So we do these sort of outliers are around the corner, and we keep bumping into those and sort of try to navigate through that and try to build that in our product.
Cool. Yeah, it's something that I've seen come up. Is like you can get auto-generated code samples, but then, and that's what I like. One of the aspects that I really liked about your talk is you guys are trying to go that one step further of how do you make them actually useful and complete, right? Because a lot of those auto-generated code samples are kind of once you try to use them, they need a lot of additional code to get them to work.
Exactly, they do. And the good thing is that our console allows us to dive into the analytics bit as well. So we can actually monitor, or our clients can monitor which language is being popular, so which code samples are developers more into. So these sort of analytics actually help you sort of shape up the direction of your API program as well. And I think that's becoming really useful especially for our enterprise clients.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Measuring the success of your documentation is another one that I haven't gotten my head around. Like figuring out, you make a change in your docs and then figuring out, well, was it the right change? I think having those kind of tools where you can get some insight into what developers are actually using. I think
Exactly, and analytics do help. And what the other feature that we're soon adding in is sort of rating, where your users can actually rate how helpful the documentation was. So yeah, that we hope could be a good tool, sort of engaging the response.
Yeah, oh yeah, sure. You get some interesting feedback sometimes.
Tell me about it.
All right, well, we have a couple more minutes. If anyone has any last questions before we wrap up. And
So I know you guys consume spec more than anything else, but I was wondering if you had any insight into whether your customers are generally automatically generating their spec, or are they manually maintaining them?
great question.
Well, I don't know if we can sort of gauge that, but yes. So we provide both options. We provide editors as well to sort of maintain your spec. But like I said, we don't auto-generate the spec. The spec is something our consumers actually maintain on their own. And what comes on top, the SDKs and documentation, that's what's auto-generated.
Are you finding that people are using the spec editor a lot? Like, do you have any information on that?
Yeah. So our spec editor is not sort of designed to make it from scratch, but it's designed to increase the SDK experience. But yes, our clients are using an editor. But then there are both use cases. There some of our clients have directly plugged API-matic into the CI/CD pipeline, so where they just maintain the spec on their own and then just plug API-matic into CI/CD pipeline and just get everything generated. But then there are some use cases where clients are actually using the editor to maintain the spec. I think it actually depends on how, as a company, you're set up, or how frequent the changes are.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else?
Do you guys have, I mean, as a developer who would be working in an IDE, do you have plugins that would allow them to generate code from within the code they're already working on, or is everything sort of copying from some sample and then trying to place it in the hierarchy, the proper packages in your source tree?
Yeah.
Actually,
I'm not. Yeah,
could you autocomplete as you're typing? Could you autocomplete as you're could you get a plugin where you could autocomplete as you're typing and it brings in like these?
I get what you mean now. We don't have something like that. So right now it's just the way we're set up is we just sort of generate the entire sample based on the flexibility that the API provider provides. But yeah, not there yet, I think.
I guess the idea would be that it would come out of the SDKs are generated by the spec. So everything has to get into the open API spec.
Yeah, a lot of developers like the automation of being in an IDE and then having it like autocomplete it within the code that they're in.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And you mean like the customer using the API is using some new API and they would just like to be able to
like if it didn't come, if it wasn't a REST API and it came as a jar or something, you just start typing it and it would fill it in for you and it would know what it is. But if there was like a plugin that allowed you to like treat the spec kind of like the interface of a jar, so your IDE knows what's available and could just fill it in for you, that would be really cool.
So I was taking a note. I'll definitely discuss it with my team if we can do something like that.
We're incubating some product ideas here. I love it. Well, thanks again for jumping on from San Francisco and doing this.
No, thank you for inviting me. Actually, it's really fun. I wish I could have flown to Ottawa. I haven't been there, but some other time.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a conference here one day about documentation and APIs. And we'll get
Yeah,
you
would love to come. Would love to come.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, hopefully the video, we're recording this tonight, and hopefully it all worked out. And I'll share that out with the meetup, and I'll put some links to API-matic, and maybe shoot me if you have any links you want me to share, Amir. Feel free to shoot those over, and I'll include those. I'll include those in the show notes, as they say in the podcasting world. And otherwise, I guess we'll say goodnight or good afternoon or whatever it is.
All right. Well, it's good afternoon here, so yeah.
Yeah.
It's 4 p.m. So, but good evening to you guys. All right.
Cool. And yeah, cool. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
And feel free to stick around for a bit, guys, and eat up as much of that food as you can. And otherwise, I'll have to lug it all home for my kids to eat.
Thanks for hosting, Nate.
I never will come.